Every October, they make your children dress up and celebrate a man who got lost looking for India and stumbled onto a continent where black people had already been trading for 200 years. They named the holiday after him. They put his face in textbooks. They built statues of him in every major city. And the whole time, that man knew he was not the first one there. He wrote it down in his own handwriting. He described meeting black traders who were already doing business with the native population when he washed up on those shores, confused about where he even was. Christopher Columbus was not a discoverer. He was a latecomer. And the man who actually led the first documented expedition from the Old World to the Americas was not some European sailor. He was an African king, the ruler of the richest empire on earth, a man with a fleet so large it makes Columbus's 3 little ships look like bathtub toys. His name was Mansa Abu Bakr II, and they erased him so completely that you are just now hearing his name for the first time. By the time this video is over, you are going to understand exactly how an African king discovered America, exactly what evidence proves it, and exactly why they have spent 500 years making sure you would never find out. Let me describe the fairy tale they fed you since kindergarten. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He was brave. He was visionary. He believed the world was round when everyone else thought it was flat. He convinced the Spanish crown to fund his impossible voyage. He crossed the Atlantic with nothing but courage and 3 tiny ships. He discovered the New World and changed history forever. They made you memorize that rhyme. They made you color pictures of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They gave you a day off school to celebrate this man, and every single part of that story is either wrong or a deliberate lie. Europeans already knew the world was round. That was not controversial. Columbus did not discover anything because you cannot discover a place where millions of people already live. And the most important lie of all, he was not the first person from the old world to make that crossing. Not even close. Vikings had been there 500 years before Columbus, and Africans had been there even before the Vikings. But you did not learn about Leif Erikson in elementary school, and you definitely did not learn about Mansa Abu Bakr II, because the story was never about truth. The story was about establishing European priority. The story was about making white people the protagonists of human history. The story was about erasing everyone who got here. Is the part that should make you furious. Columbus himself knew he was not the first. He wrote about it in his own journals, in his own words. He documented evidence that black Africans had reached the Americas before him. On his 3rd voyage, Columbus wrote that he encountered indigenous people who told him about black-skinned people who had come from the south and southeast trading in gold-tipped spears. The native word for these spears was guanin, and when Columbus had the metal analyzed, it was the exact same gold alloy that was being produced in West Africa. Same ratio of gold, silver, and copper. Not similar, exact. Columbus also wrote about finding black bodies washed ashore and about hearing consistent stories from multiple native groups about dark-skinned visitors who had come before. He noted that the indigenous people had cloth similar to the cotton fabrics produced in West Africa. He observed trading patterns that made no sense if Europeans were the first outsiders to arrive. This information is not hidden in some secret archive. It is in Columbus's published journals that scholars have had access to for centuries. They just do not teach it to you because it destroys the mythology. The man they celebrate as the great discoverer spent his voyages collecting evidence that Africans had beaten him there. And then everyone agreed to pretend that evidence did not exist. Now let me tell you about the man they should be building statues of. Mansa Abu Bakr II was the 9th Mansa, or emperor, of the Mali Empire. He ruled in the early 1300s, almost 200 years before Columbus was even born. To understand who Abu Bakr was, you first have to understand what Mali was. This was not some small tribal kingdom. This was one of the largest and wealthiest empires in human history. At its peak, Mali covered an area larger than Western Europe. It controlled the trans-Saharan gold trade that made the medieval economy function. It contained the city of Timbuktu, which had universities and libraries when most of Europe was still illiterate. The previous Mansa Musa, made a pilgrimage to Mecca and spent so much gold along the way that he crashed the economies of every city he passed through for a decade. That is how rich Mali was. That is how powerful Mali was. And Abu Bakr II ruled this empire. He commanded resources that European kings could not even imagine. He had access to the most advanced shipbuilding technology in West Africa. He had scholars and navigators and sailors with generations of maritime experience. And he had a burning obsession with one question: what lay on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean? I need you to understand what Mali actually looked like so you can understand why this expedition was possible. Timbuktu alone had 3 major universities that attracted scholars from across Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe. The Sankore University had a library with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and navigation. While Europeans were burning people for witchcraft, Malian scholars were calculating astronomical positions and mapping ocean currents. Mali had a professional navy. They had been sailing the Atlantic coast for generations. They traded with Morocco to the north and with kingdoms all the way down to modern-day Ghana and Senegal. They understood the ocean in ways that Europeans would not figure out for another century. The empire had abundant timber for shipbuilding, skilled craftsmen who had been perfecting their boats for centuries, and the wealth to finance any expedition the Mansa could imagine. When European historians pretend that Africans could not have crossed the Atlantic, they are revealing their own ignorance. Mali had everything necessary for oceanic exploration: technology, knowledge, resources, and motivation. What they do not have is white skin, which is apparently the only credential that matters when European historians decide who gets credit for discovering what. Around 1310, Mansa Abu Bakr II assembled a fleet of 200 ships. Let that number sink in. 200 ships. Columbus had 3. Abu Bakr sent 200 vessels into the Atlantic Ocean with orders to explore until they found land or ran out of supplies. He loaded them with enough food and water for 2 years. He staffed them with his best sailors and navigators. He gave them clear instructions to push west until they reached the other side. The account of what happened comes from Arab historians who documented it, and from the oral traditions preserved by Malian griots, the professional storytellers and historians who maintained records across generations. According to these accounts, the fleet departed from the coast of what is now Senegal or Gambia. They sailed into the Atlantic following the currents and the winds, and they did not come back. All except one, a single ship, returned to Mali. The captain told Abu Bakr that the fleet had encountered a massive river in the middle of the ocean, a current so strong that ships were being pulled into it and disappearing. Most of the fleet had pushed forward into this current, following orders to explore no matter what. But this one captain had held back, watched his fellow ships vanish into the current, and decided to return and report. Abu Bakr listened to this account. He questioned the captain thoroughly, and then he made a decision that changed history, even though history refuses to remember it. Put yourself in Abu Bakr's position for a moment. You just lost 200 ships and hundreds of your best men to an ocean that swallowed them whole. The smart thing to do would be to mourn your losses, declare the Atlantic uncrossable, and focus on your land empire that was already the richest in the world. That is what most rulers would have done. That is not what Abu Bakr did. He decided that if his men were going to sail into the unknown, he would sail with them. He refused to send another fleet to their potential deaths while he sat safely on his throne in comfort. The king himself would lead the next expedition. Think about the character that requires. This was not some young prince trying to prove himself. Abu Bakr was already the undisputed ruler of one of the greatest empires on earth. He had nothing to prove. He had everything to lose. And he chose to risk it all because he could not ask his people to face dangers he was not willing to face himself. He appointed a regent to rule Mali in his absence. He chose his deputy, Mansa Musa, who would go on to become the most famous ruler in Malian history. He put his affairs in order, assembled his fleet, and prepared to sail into the same ocean that had just swallowed 200 of his ships without a trace. In 1311, Mansa Abu Bakr II launched the second expedition. This time, he assembled 2,000 ships. Not a typo. 2,000. Half were filled with supplies, food, water, extra equipment, everything necessary for a journey of unknown length. The other half carried soldiers, sailors, explorers, craftsmen, and the Mansa himself. This was not an exploration party. This was a colonization fleet. Abu Bakr was not just trying to see what was on the other side of the ocean. He was preparing to establish a Malian presence there permanently. The fleet departed from the West African coast and sailed into the Atlantic, and they never came back. Mansa Abu Bakr II was never heard from again. No ship returned, no message arrived. The king who ruled the richest empire on earth vanished into the ocean along with 2,000 ships and tens of thousands of his people. Mansa Musa took the throne and ruled for the next 25 years, becoming so wealthy and famous that he is still remembered as the richest person who ever lived. But he was only ruling because Abu Bakr had sailed west and never returned. The official history says Abu Bakr died at sea, that the Atlantic took him like it took the first fleet. Case closed. But here is the thing about the Atlantic Ocean. It does not swallow 2,000 ships without a trace. Something happened to that fleet. Someone landed somewhere, and the evidence of what happened has been suppressed for 7 centuries. Now, some of you are wondering how Malians could have possibly crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1311. Europeans barely managed it in 1492, and they had more advanced ships, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. First of all, the Atlantic crossing from West Africa to South America is much shorter and easier than the crossing from Spain to the Caribbean. The distance from Senegal to Brazil is about 1,600 miles. The distance from Spain to the Bahamas is about 4,000 miles. Columbus had the harder route. Second, the ocean currents and trade winds form a natural conveyor belt that practically pushes you from West Africa to South America. The North Equatorial Current and the Canary Current flow directly from the African coast toward the Americas. Malian sailors have been studying these currents for generations. They knew the patterns. They understood the winds. They had the knowledge to use these natural forces to carry them across. Third, Malian shipbuilding was sophisticated. They built large ocean-going vessels capable of carrying substantial cargo and crew. They had been conducting maritime trade for centuries. The idea that they could not have crossed an ocean that Pacific Islanders had been crossing in wooden canoes for thousands of years is ridiculous. It is not a real argument. It is racism dressed up as skepticism. When Thor Heyerdahl crossed the Atlantic on a papyrus raft in 1970 to prove ancient Africans could have done it, the academic establishment shrugged and went back to pretending it was impossible. The evidence does not matter to people who are committed to the lie. So what happened when Africans reached the Americas? We have evidence scattered across the continent. We have archaeological findings, cultural artifacts, oral histories, and physical remains that point to African presence long before Columbus arrived. In Brazil, researchers have found skeletal remains with African cranial features dating to well before European contact. In Mexico, ceramic figures with distinctly African features have been found in pre-Columbian sites. In Peru, African plants that could only have arrived through human transport have been identified in ancient contexts. The Mandinka people of West Africa have oral traditions about voyages across the Great Water and about relatives who sailed west and never returned. These traditions match the story of Abu Bakr's expedition detail for detail. They remember the fleet, they remember the king, they remember the departure. Some scholars have traced linguistic connections between Mandinka language and certain indigenous American languages, words, phrases, and grammatical structures that suggest contact and exchange. The Mendi script from West Africa shows up in pre-Columbian inscriptions in Mexico. These are not coincidences. These are not parallel developments. This is evidence of contact that the academic mainstream refuses to take seriously because it threatens the Columbus mythology. Now let me tell you about the evidence that is impossible to ignore. So impossible that they have to work overtime to explain it away. The Olmec civilization flourished in Mexico from about 1500 BC to 400 BC. They are considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the civilization that influenced the Maya and the Aztec, and every major civilization that followed them in that region. And the most famous artifacts they left behind are the colossal stone heads. 17 of these massive sculptures have been found. They weigh up to 50 tons each. They stand up to 11 feet tall, and they have features that are unmistakably African. Broad, flat noses, full lips, the facial structure of West African people. The first European archaeologists who encountered these heads in the 19th century immediately noted their African appearance. It was obvious. It was undeniable. It was right there in front of their faces, carved in stone. So what did the academic establishment do? They made up explanations. They said the features were just stylized artistic choices. They said the sculptures represented jaguars in human form. They said the flat noses were caused by weathering, even though the weathering would have had to somehow widen the noses rather than erode them. They will say anything except the obvious explanation that stares you in the face every time you look at one of these heads. African people were in Mexico thousands of years ago. They were present at the founding of Mesoamerican civilization. Their faces were considered important enough to carve into multi-ton monuments that have survived for 3,000 years. And mainstream archaeology would rather blame jaguars than admit that black people helped build the Americas. The indigenous peoples of the Americas have their own records and memories, and those records consistently mention black visitors who arrived long before the Europeans. The Aztec people spoke of their god Quetzalcoatl having companions who were described as dark-skinned and woolly-haired. The Maya had traditions about visitors from across the Eastern Sea who came in ancient times. Native peoples of the Caribbean told Columbus directly about the black traders who had been there before him. The Garifuna people of Central America are a living testament to African presence. They are the descendants of African and indigenous Caribbean people who mixed long before the transatlantic slave trade began. Their culture preserves African traditions, African words, and African knowledge that cannot be explained by the slave trade alone. When European colonizers arrived, they encountered indigenous people who already had names for black people, already had trading relationships with black visitors, already had cultural exchange happening that predated any European presence. The colonizers noted this in their records, scratched their heads about it, and then proceeded to pretend it did not matter, because acknowledging African priority in the Americas would have undermined the entire justification for European colonization. They could not claim to be bringing civilization to an empty savage wilderness if Africans had already been there establishing trade relationships and exchanging knowledge. Let me hit you with some evidence that made mainstream scientists completely lose their minds when it came out. In 1992, a German toxicologist named Svetlana Balabanova was testing Egyptian mummies for drug residue as part of a study on ancient diseases. What she found defied everything we supposedly knew about history. The mummies contained nicotine and cocaine. Nicotine comes from tobacco. Cocaine comes from coca leaves. Both of these plants are native to the Americas. They did not exist anywhere else in the world until after Columbus. So how did drugs that only grew in the Americas end up in the bodies of Egyptian mummies that were sealed in tombs thousands of years before Columbus was born? The obvious answer is that ancient Africans crossed the Atlantic, obtained these substances, and brought them back. But that answer was unacceptable. It would prove that transatlantic contact existed thousands of years ago. It would prove that Africans had been making the crossing regularly enough to establish trade in exotic goods. So the academic establishment attacked. They said the test must have been contaminated. Balabanova tested more mummies. Same results. They said the mummies must have been fake. She tested authenticated mummies from verified tombs. Same results. They said maybe the plants grew in Africa too and just went extinct. No botanical evidence supports this. They would rather invent invisible extinct plants than admit that Africans had been crossing the Atlantic for thousands of years. Let me return to Columbus because his own journals are damning testimony that they cannot explain away. Columbus wrote about meeting native people who showed him golden spearheads and told him they came from black traders. He had the metal tested and it matched West African gold alloys exactly. He wrote about cloth that matched West African textile patterns. He wrote about finding a canoe with African goods aboard. He noted that the native word for the golden spearheads, guanin, was almost identical to the Mandinka word for gold. Columbus's own son, Ferdinand Columbus, wrote a biography of his father that includes these observations. He noted his father's confusion about the African presence that was already evident in the Caribbean. The Spanish court received these reports. European scholars read these accounts, and everyone agreed to collectively ignore what Columbus was telling them because it complicated the story they wanted to tell about European discovery and European priority. This is not speculation. These are primary sources written by Columbus and his immediate family. The man they celebrate every October documented African presence in the Americas with his own hand, and then they named the holiday after him anyway. Why did they need Columbus to be first so badly? Because discovery was the legal justification for conquest. Under European law at the time, you could claim land that had been discovered by a Christian monarch. The discovery doctrine became the foundation for colonizing the Americas, stealing the land from indigenous peoples, and establishing European dominion over an entire hemisphere. But the discovery doctrine only worked if Europeans were the discoverers. If Africans had been there first, the legal framework fell apart. Worse, if African kingdoms had legitimate claims based on prior contact, they might demand recognition of those claims. European powers might have to negotiate with African rulers as equals rather than enslaving them as inferiors. The entire colonial project depended on establishing European priority, so they established it through propaganda and suppression and willful blindness. They ignored the evidence Columbus himself collected. They dismissed the oral histories of indigenous peoples. They refused to seriously investigate artifacts that pointed to African presence. And they built a mythology so powerful that 500 years later, school children still learn that Columbus discovered America even though he did not discover anything, and America is a name that belongs to a completely different Italian explorer who also was not first. The African side of the story has been systematically attacked. When Europeans began colonizing Africa, they showed particular interest in destroying libraries and historical records. The library at Timbuktu, which contained detailed records of Malian expeditions and maritime activity, was repeatedly attacked and scattered. Manuscripts were burned, stolen, or left to decay. The oral traditions of the griots were dismissed as legend rather than history. European scholars did not even attempt to seriously investigate African historical claims until very recently, and even now most mainstream historians treat African oral history as folklore while treating European oral traditions like Beowulf as legitimate historical sources. The destruction was not accidental. Colonial powers understood that controlling history meant controlling power. If Africans could prove prior presence in the Americas, it would complicate the story that justified colonization. So they burned the evidence, dismissed the testimony, and built academic institutions that treated any claim of African achievement with automatic suspicion while accepting European claims at face value. The records that survived did so despite systematic attempts to destroy them. What we know about Abu Bakr II comes from fragments that escaped burning, from oral traditions that survived despite suppression, from Arabic sources that Europeans could not easily destroy. Imagine what we would know if they had not spent 5 centuries trying to erase it. Today, if you bring up pre-Columbian African contact in an academic setting, you will be met with hostility, not disagreement, hostility. Scholars will call you an Afrocentrist as if that is an insult. They will demand evidence to a standard they never apply to European claims. They will dismiss physical evidence as coincidence, oral traditions as mythology, and textual sources as misinterpretation. Watch how they treat the Olmec heads. Ask them to explain why these massive monuments have African features, and they will tie themselves in knots, avoiding the obvious conclusion. Stylized art. Jaguar transformation. Anything except admitting what their own eyes tell them. Watch how they treat the cocaine mummies. They would rather hypothesize extinct plants and contaminated labs than accept that the evidence means what it obviously means. Watch how they treat Columbus's own journals. They teach Columbus as a hero in elementary school, but suddenly his testimony becomes unreliable when he documents African presence. The resistance is not scientific. Science follows evidence wherever it leads. This is ideological. The academic establishment has spent centuries building a framework where European civilization is the protagonist of human history and everyone else is the supporting character at best. African priority in the Americas threatens that framework at its foundation, so they fight it with everything they have, not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are too threatening to accept. I have told you this story before. I told it to you about Cleopatra, the African queen they painted white because they could not admit that Rome's greatest enemy was black. I told it to you about Onesimus, the enslaved man whose African medical knowledge saved Boston and then got credited to white ministers and white doctors. And now I am telling it to you about Mansa Abu Bakr II, the African king who discovered America and got erased so that a lost Italian sailor could take his place in history. The pattern is always the same. African achievement gets erased. African contribution gets stolen. African priority gets denied. And white Europeans get credit for things they did not do, discovered by people they claimed were too primitive to discover anything. They told you Africa had no history worth learning. They told you black people contributed nothing to civilization. They told you Europe invented exploration and discovery and progress, while Africa sat in darkness waiting to be civilized. Every single one of those claims is a lie designed to keep you ignorant of your own heritage. Your ancestors were building universities while Europe was burning witches. Your ancestors were crossing oceans while Europeans thought the sea was full of monsters. Your ancestors were trading with the Americas while Columbus was still trying to convince someone to fund his expedition. They did not want you to know that. They still do not want you to know that. Because once you know it, you start asking questions that powerful people have spent centuries making sure you would never ask. Imagine for a moment what the world would look like if Abu Bakr had gotten credit for discovering America. Imagine if the history books taught that an African king reached the Americas almost 2 centuries before Columbus. Imagine if children grew up learning about Malian navigation and Malian courage instead of European destiny. Would the slave trade have been possible? Could Europeans have justified enslaving people whose civilizations they already knew had achieved great things? Could they have built a racial hierarchy that put Africans at the bottom if everyone knew that Africans had been exploring the world before Europe figured out how to make ocean-worthy ships? The erasure of Abu Bakr was not just about history. It was about constructing a racial framework that would justify centuries of exploitation. Africans had to be primitive for colonization to make sense. Africans had to be incapable for slavery to be justified. Africans had to be erased from history so that Europeans could claim history belonged to them. When they stole Abu Bakr's discovery from him, they were not just taking credit for a voyage. They were building the intellectual foundation for white supremacy. They were creating the mythology that would convince your great-grandparents that they were inferior. They were planting lies in the soil that you are still trying to dig out 500 years later. So why should you care about a Malian king who sailed into the Atlantic 700 years ago? Because the lie about Columbus is a lie about you. When they teach children that Europeans discovered everything and Africans discovered nothing, they are teaching those children a specific understanding of who matters and who does not. Black children grow up learning that their ancestors were passive recipients of history rather than active makers of it. White children grow up learning that their ancestors were the only ones who built anything worth remembering. Both groups are being lied to, and both groups suffer from those lies in different ways. But the lies hurt black children more. Because when you grow up thinking your people never contributed anything, you internalize that. It shapes how you see yourself, how you see your community, how you see your potential. The erasure of Abu Bakr II is not ancient history that does not affect anyone anymore. It is ongoing psychological warfare. Every Columbus Day parade, every textbook chapter about the age of exploration, every museum exhibit that credits Europeans with discovering places where people already lived is a continuation of the same project that erased Abu Bakr and Cleopatra and Onesimus and countless others. Knowing the truth does not change the past, but it changes how you understand the present. It changes what you believe is possible. It changes who you think you are. They gave you a whole holiday for a man who got lost looking for India. They built statues of him in major cities across a country he never set foot in. They named the capital district of the most powerful nation on earth after him. And the whole time, they knew. They had the evidence in his own journals. They had the Olmec heads staring them in the face. They had the oral histories from 2 continents. They had the cocaine in the mummies and the gold alloys that matched, and the linguistic connections that could not be coincidence. They knew an African king had led 2,000 ships into that ocean almost 200 years earlier. They knew Mansa Abu Bakr II had made the crossing before Columbus was born, and they buried it so deep that you lived your whole life without hearing his name. His name was Mansa Abu Bakr II. He ruled the richest empire on earth. He refused to send his people into danger that he would not face himself. He assembled the largest exploratory fleet in human history and sailed west to find out what lay beyond the horizon. And he found it. The evidence says he found it. The archaeology says he found it. Columbus's own journals say someone found it before Columbus did. They just did not want that someone to be black. Now you know. You know about Onesimus, who saved Boston. You know about Cleopatra, who terrified Rome. You know about Abu Bakr, who discovered America. And I am just getting started. Next time, I am going to tell you about the African emperor who was running Rome while everyone thought it was a white empire. If you thought this one was something, that story is going to turn everything you think you know about Europe completely upside down. Stay with me. We are just getting started.